Hello and welcome to Chills of Story. Today, we're diving into horror with a terrifying new tale that might haunt you long after it ends. If you love chills, mysteries, and stories that send shivers down your spine, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video so you won't miss our upcoming stories. Now, sit back, turn off the lights, and let yourself be drawn into this nightmarish adventure. Here's the horror story, The Forest of Shadows. Part 1, Arrival in the Forest. Chapter 1, The Road into the Unknown. The tires crunched softly on the gravel as the car crawled along the winding path, which was becoming narrower with each passing minute. The car's GPS beeped, signaling that they were almost there, but all Clemens could see outside the window was a dense forest, growing darker and more oppressive as they advanced. "This place is really in the middle of nowhere," Theo remarked with a wry grin from the back seat. He'd spent most of the trip making jokes about their decision to escape to such a remote place. "That's the best part, right? No neighbors, no noise, just us and nature," replied Elise, clearly excited about the weekend getaway far from the hustle of the city. Samuel, who was driving, remained silent, his focus locked on the road ahead. He was the one who had found this house to rent, at a bargain price, and he hoped everyone would enjoy it. But as the forest seemed to close in around them, even he began to question his choice. After a few minutes of silence, the car finally emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood an old wooden house, sturdy but weathered. The windows were black, reflecting the dim light of the setting sun, giving the house a sinister look. "It's more rustic than I imagined," murmured Clemens as she stepped out of the car. They exchanged glances, some excited, some uneasy. The place had a strange, unsettling vibe, but none of them were prepared for just how deep the horror would go. Chapter 2, The Legend of the Forest. The first few hours in the house passed without incident as everyone unpacked and settled in. The house was larger inside than it appeared, though there was an odd, musty smell, almost as if no one had lived there in decades. After dinner, they gathered around the fireplace, its flames crackling warmly. Theo uncorked a bottle of whiskey, ready to kick off the night with some fun. This was the moment they had all been looking forward to, a peaceful weekend, away from the pressures of life. "Anyone know a good ghost story?" Theo asked, pouring a glass for everyone. Samuel, who had been unusually quiet for most of the evening, looked up at the others, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Well, I've heard a story about this forest." The group turned toward him, intrigued. Apparently, this forest has a bit of a reputation. Centuries ago, a group of villagers practiced strange rituals here. Some say they offered human sacrifices. The trees were said to be inhabited by ancient spirits, creatures that fed on fear. After several villagers mysteriously vanished, the nearby settlement was abandoned, and no one dared come back. Until now, I guess. A heavy silence fell over the group. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting eerie shadows. Clemens shivered, though the room was warm. "You can't be serious," Elise laughed nervously, trying to dispel the tension. Samuel shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm just repeating what I heard. It's probably just a local legend." But deep down, something in the room had shifted. A cold dread began to settle over them, an unshakable feeling that maybe the legend was more than just a story. Chapter 3, The First Night. The first night in the house was restless. After everyone had gone to bed, Clemens tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Samuel's story kept replaying in her mind, filling her with an unease she couldn't explain. Around 2 in the morning, she was jolted awake by a strange noise. It was faint but unmistakable, something was scratching softly at her bedroom door. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, but the sound stopped abruptly. Breathing shallowly, she lay back down, her eyes fixed on the door. For the rest of the night, she remained wide awake, unable to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. Meanwhile, upstairs in another room, Theo also heard something, whispers, faint and distant, coming from the forest outside. He got out of bed, went to the window, and peered into the darkness. He saw nothing, yet the whispers seemed to grow louder, as if something out there was calling to him. Chapter 4: The Strange Discovery. Despite the unsettling events of the night, they decided to go exploring the next day. After all, they had come to enjoy nature and escape the stress of city life. Samuel suggested a short hike through the woods surrounding the house. They walked quietly along narrow trails, admiring the towering, ancient trees. However, an odd sensation clung to them, as if the forest itself was observing their every move. After about an hour, Elise tripped over a gnarled root and stumbled near an old, twisted tree. As she stood up, brushing off the dirt, something caught her eye. Beneath the roots of the tree was an old, weathered book, its leather cover cracked and faded. "What the hell is this?" she muttered, pulling it free. The group gathered around her as she carefully opened the book. Inside were pages filled with strange symbols, ancient and indecipherable. Elise, who studied history, was immediately fascinated. Samuel, however, frowned. "I don't think we should mess with this," he warned, his voice tense. "There's something wrong with it." But it was too late. From that moment on, the forest felt darker, more hostile. Unbeknownst to them, they had awakened something ancient, something evil. Chapter 5: Nightmares and Shadows. That night, Clement's dreams were filled with terror. She saw herself wandering the forest, alone, with the trees whispering her name. Shadowy figures moved among the branches, watching her, stalking her. In the dream, she turned to run, but the ground beneath her crumbled, pulling her into a dark abyss. She woke with a start, her heart racing, the echo of her own scream still ringing in her ears. The room was cold, too cold for the middle of summer, and her breath formed small clouds in the air. At the same time, in the room across the hall, Theo lay awake, unable to move. His eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling, while shadows crawled along the walls, forming strange, unnatural shapes. He tried to cry out, but his voice was gone, as if something was holding him in place. Morning couldn't come soon enough, but with each passing night, the forest, and the house, seemed to grow more sinister. And soon, they would realize that the real nightmare was just beginning. Part 2: The Haunting Unfolds. Chapter 6: The Book's Curse. The group sat in silence around the dining table, the unease from the previous night heavy in the air. Clemence toyed nervously with her fork, her eyes darting to the old book that Elise had found under the tree. Its presence seemed to radiate something dark, something malignant. "We should get rid of it," Clemence said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but the others heard the fear behind it. Samuel nodded in agreement. "I don't like it. Since we found that thing, something's been off." Elise looked conflicted, her fingers tracing the strange symbols on the cover. "It's just a book. We don't even know what it says. Maybe it's some kind of old manuscript. There's no reason to think." "There's every reason to think it's dangerous," Theo interrupted. "Last night I couldn't sleep. I swear I heard whispers coming from the woods, and I'm not imagining things. This place is wrong." Loic, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "Maybe we should take it back to the tree. Put it back where we found it." The group exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to go back into the forest, especially with the growing sense that the trees themselves were alive, watching their every move. But deep down, they all knew Loic was right. Chapter 7: The Return to the Forest. Later that afternoon, with the sun already sinking behind the thick canopy of trees, they decided to return the book to the twisted tree where Elise had found it. The forest seemed darker than before, as if something was waiting for them. As they neared the tree, the air grew colder. A strange fog began to rise from the ground, curling around their legs like the grasping fingers of unseen spirits. Clemence shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her, feeling the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on all sides. "We're almost there," Elise whispered, her voice barely audible over the crunching leaves beneath their feet. When they reached the clearing, something was wrong. The tree looked different, its gnarled branches twisted in unnatural angles, and the roots seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The clearing, once quiet and serene, now felt like the heart of something evil. "Just put it back," Theo urged, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows between the trees. Elise hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and placing the book back beneath the roots. As soon as her fingers left the cover, the ground beneath them trembled, and a low, guttural sound rumbled through the earth. It was as if the forest itself was responding to their action, awakening from a long slumber. "We need to leave now," Samuel said, his voice filled with panic. They turned to run, but the path they had taken seemed to vanish behind them. The trees closed in, their branches intertwining above, blocking out the light. The forest had them now. Chapter 8, The Forest's Wrath. As they stumbled through the thick underbrush, desperate to find their way back to the house, Clemence could feel something stalking them. The shadows between the trees seemed to move on their own, growing longer, darker. The whispers that Theo had mentioned were back, more distinct now, like voices calling to them from just beyond the edge of hearing. "Faster," Samuel urged, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The fog grew thicker, swirling around them, distorting their sense of direction. No matter how far they ran, the forest seemed endless, trapping them in a nightmarish loop. The house, their only sanctuary, was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, Loic stopped, his eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" They froze, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. Then, from the shadows, came the unmistakable sound of something moving. Something large. The trees creaked and groaned as if bending under the weight of a massive, unseen presence. Clemence grabbed Samuel's arm. "What is that?" Before anyone could answer, a dark figure emerged from the fog. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its face obscured by a hood. Its limbs moved in jerky, unnatural motions, as if it were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Run!" Theo screamed, and they bolted, crashing through the underbrush. But no matter how fast they ran, the figure followed, always just out of reach but never far behind. Its presence seemed to distort reality itself. The trees warped, the ground shifted beneath their feet, and the air grew colder with each passing second. Chapter 9, The Possession. By the time they burst through the edge of the forest and reached the house, the sun had fully set, leaving them in darkness. They slammed the door behind them, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What the hell was that?" Elise whispered, her voice trembling. No one had an answer. They were all shaken, their minds struggling to process what they had just seen. But as they stood there, trying to calm their racing hearts, they didn't notice the change in Loic. He stood at the back of the group, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. He hadn't spoken since they returned from the forest. Slowly, he turned his head to the window, staring out into the darkness beyond. "Loic?" Clemence asked, stepping toward him. "Are you okay?" But when he turned to face her, his eyes were different. They were dark, almost black, as if something else was looking out from behind them. His lips twisted into a cruel smile. "The forest has you now," he said, his voice a low, guttural whisper. Before anyone could react, Loic lunged at Clemence, his hands wrapping around her throat. She gasped, struggling against his grip, her eyes wide with terror. The others rushed forward, pulling him off her, but it took all their strength to drag him away. He fought like a man possessed, his eyes wild and unseeing. "What's happening to him?" Elise cried, her voice filled with panic. "I don't know," Samuel shouted, pinning Loic to the ground. "But this isn't him. Something's taken over." As they restrained Loic, Clemence coughed, rubbing her bruised throat, her mind racing. Whatever they had awakened in the forest had followed them back, and it was using Loic as its vessel. Chapter 10, The Darkening. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to close in on them. Every creak, every shadow, made their skin crawl. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the whispers of the forest. Loic sat in the corner, bound to a chair, his head hanging low. Every so often, he would mutter words in a language none of them understood, his voice sounding more and more inhuman with each passing hour. "We can't stay here," Theo said, pacing the room. "We need to leave. Now." "But where would we go?" Elise asked, her voice small. "The forest is out there. And it's worse than anything inside this house." Clemence stared at Loic, her heart heavy with dread. "We need to figure out what that thing is. And how to stop it." Samuel stood up, grabbing the old book they had found. "Maybe this is the key. It has to be." As he opened the book, the symbols on the pages seemed to pulse, almost as if they were alive. And as he began to read, a terrible realization dawned on him. The book wasn't just an artifact, it was a doorway, a way for the ancient evil in the forest to reach them. And now, that evil had found a way in. Part 3, The Descent into Madness. Chapter 11, The Ritual Revealed. Samuel's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages of the cursed book, the strange symbols seeming to shift under his gaze. The more he read, the clearer it became, this wasn't just a collection of strange stories or ancient history. It was a manual, a guide to rituals designed to summon and control the dark entities that lurked in the forest. "We should never have touched this," he muttered, his voice shaking with fear. Theo leaned over his shoulder, trying to make sense of the text. "What does it say? Can we stop this thing?" Samuel shook his head, his eyes widening as he found the passage he had been searching for. "It's not about stopping it. It's about feeding it." Clemence, who had been tending to Loic, looked up sharply. "Feeding it? What does that mean?" Samuel swallowed hard, his face pale. "These spirits, or whatever they are, they feed on fear, on human suffering. That's why the village disappeared centuries ago. The people were offering sacrifices to keep the forest at bay. But when they stopped, the forest took them. So, what? We're supposed to sacrifice someone?" Elise asked, her voice rising in panic. Samuel looked at the group, his expression grim. "That's what the book says. The only way to appease the spirits is with a life." The room fell into a stunned silence. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. No one wanted to believe it, but deep down, they all knew the truth. They had unleashed something ancient and evil, and now it was demanding a price. Chapter 12, Loic's Transformation. As the group grappled with the horrific realization, Loic, who had been eerily silent in the corner, suddenly let out a low, guttural growl. His head snapped up, and his eyes, once dull and lifeless, were now glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. "Loic?" Clemence whispered, taking a cautious step toward him. But the thing that looked at her from behind Loic's eyes was no longer her friend. His face twisted into a grotesque smile, and when he spoke, it wasn't his voice that came out, it was something ancient, something filled with malice. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "The forest has claimed you. One by one, you will fall." Theo lunged forward, grabbing a chair and swinging it at Loic. The possessed man barely flinched as the chair broke over his back, his twisted smile never faltering. Instead, he stood up, slowly breaking free from the ropes that bound him, as if they were mere threads. "Get back!" Samuel shouted, pushing Clemence behind him. Loic, or the thing that had taken over his body, laughed, a deep, unnatural sound that echoed through the house. "You think you can fight us? We are the forest. We are eternal." Without warning, Loic charged at Theo, his hands reaching for his throat. The force knocked Theo to the ground, and they struggled, but Loic was unnaturally strong, his eyes glowing brighter with every second. "Help!" Theo gasped, clawing at Loic's hands. Samuel and Elise rushed forward, trying to pull Loic off, but it was like trying to move a statue. Finally, with a surge of desperate strength, Clemens grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and swung it hard at the back of Loic's head. The blow knocked him off Theo, sending him crashing to the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Then Loic began to convulse violently, his body jerking and twisting as if something was trying to rip its way out of him. Dark veins crawled across his skin, and a horrible, inhuman scream filled the room. "We have to get out of here," Elise whispered, her face pale. But Samuel shook his head, his voice grim. "We can't leave him like this. He's still our friend. There has to be a way to save him." Chapter 13, The Escape Plan. After dragging Loic's unconscious body into another room and locking the door, the group huddled together, their nerves frayed, trying to come up with a plan. The house had become a prison, and outside, the forest whispered to them, its malevolent presence pressing against the walls. "What if we just run for it?" Elise suggested. "We can get in the car and drive away. There's no way this thing can follow us if we're far enough away." Samuel looked skeptical. "You saw what happened in the forest. The path disappeared. I think it's too late to leave." Theo, still rubbing his neck from Loic's attack, nodded. "The forest won't let us go. It's playing with us, keeping us here." Clemens, who had been staring out the window, suddenly spoke. "Maybe we need to destroy the book." They all turned to her. "What do you mean?" Samuel asked. "The book is the key, right?" Clemens said, her voice stronger now. "It's what brought this, whatever it is. Maybe if we destroy it, we can stop all of this." Theo looked uncertain. "What if destroying it makes things worse?" "It can't get much worse than this," Clemens replied, her eyes darting to the door where Loic lay. After a tense silence, Samuel nodded. "It's worth a shot. We'll burn the book." Chapter 14, The Burning. The group gathered around the fireplace, the cursed book resting on the hearth. Samuel took a deep breath, holding a lit match over the ancient pages. The symbols seemed to pulse, as if alive, warning them against what they were about to do. "We have to do this together," he said, his voice low. "No turning back." Clemens, Elise, and Theo nodded in agreement, their faces pale but resolute. Samuel dropped the match onto the book. At first, nothing happened. The flames licked at the edges of the pages, curling the leather cover. But as the fire began to consume the book, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a low, ominous sound filled the air, like the groaning of the earth itself. The house began to shake, and outside, the wind howled violently. The trees swayed, their branches thrashing against the windows, as if the forest was in a frenzy. "It's working!" Elise shouted over the noise. But as the book burned, Loic, still locked in the other room, began to scream, a blood-curdling wail that pierced the air. His voice was not his own, but that of something ancient, something furious. The walls rattled, and cracks began to form along the ceiling. "We have to get out of here!" Theo yelled. The group ran for the door, the house groaning and shaking around them. As they burst outside, the forest seemed to come alive, the trees bent and twisted, the wind whipping through the clearing like a hurricane. But as they ran toward the car, the house behind them collapsed in on itself, the flames devouring everything. They barely made it to the car before the forest seemed to close in on them. Samuel floored the gas pedal, and they sped away from the clearing, the wind still howling behind them. The further they drove, the quieter it became, until finally, the oppressive presence of the forest faded into the distance. Chapter 15: The Price of Escape. They drove in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, their minds still reeling from the horrors they had just escaped. The road ahead stretched out endlessly, the forest on either side seeming less menacing now, but still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "Do you think it's over?" Elise asked quietly. Samuel shook his head. "I don't know. But we stopped whatever was in that house." Clemence stared out the window, her face pale and drawn. "But we left Loic behind." A heavy silence followed her words. No one knew what had truly happened to Loic, whether he was still alive or if the thing that had taken him was gone forever. But deep down, they all knew the truth. Loic was gone, claimed by the forest, a price paid for their escape. As they drove further from the cursed woods, the whispers faded, but none of them could shake the feeling that the forest was still watching, still waiting. Because the forest never truly lets you go. Part 4: The Return of the Darkness. Chapter 16: Lingering Shadows. They drove for hours, but the feeling of unease never left. Clemence, staring out of the window at the blur of trees speeding by, couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. The forest was behind them, the cursed house reduced to ashes, yet her chest tightened as if invisible hands were gripping her heart. "How far are we from the nearest town?" she asked, her voice thin and strained. Samuel checked the dashboard. "Not far. Maybe half an hour." The others sat in silence, their faces drawn and pale. Theo hadn't said a word since they had fled the house, and Elise kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear on the road behind them. As they rounded a bend in the road, something strange happened. The sky, which had been gradually darkening with the approaching evening, suddenly shifted. A deep fog rolled in from the trees, swallowing the road in front of them. "This doesn't feel right," Elise whispered. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered. Samuel frowned, glancing at the fuel gauge. "What the hell? We had a full tank." The car jerked violently before coming to a dead stop in the middle of the road. The forest seemed to creep closer, the trees almost leaning in, like sentinels watching their every move. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. "Something's here," Theo muttered, his voice barely audible. The silence was broken by a sudden, sharp knock on the car window. Clemence screamed, and Samuel jerked his head toward the sound. A shadowy figure stood just outside, its face obscured by the thick fog. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly long. "No," Elise breathed, backing away from the window. "It can't be." The figure raised a hand and knocked again, slowly, rhythmically, as if it had all the time in the world. The car was suddenly filled with a cold, oppressive dread. None of them dared to move. "We need to get out of here," Samuel said, his voice hoarse. "Now." But when they tried to open the doors, they found them locked, unmovable. The figure outside began to circle the car, its hollow footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Every knock against the window sent waves of panic through the group, the sound reverberating like a death knell. "We can't stay here," Theo yelled, pounding on the dashboard in frustration. Suddenly, the figure stopped directly in front of the car. Slowly, it leaned down, peering through the windshield. The fog seemed to part around it, revealing a face devoid of features, just smooth, pale skin stretched over a hollow skull. Without warning, the headlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Chapter 17: The Twisted Road. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. The road ahead stretched out into nothingness, the fog swirling like a living thing. The oppressive weight in the air was still there, pressing down on them, but the immediate threat seemed to have disappeared. "What the hell was that?" Elise whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Samuel replied, wiping the sweat from his brow. "But we need to keep moving. We're too exposed out here." Clemens checked the doors again, relieved to find them unlocked this time. "Should we walk? If the car won't start." Just as the words left her mouth, the engine roared to life, startling everyone. Samuel hesitated for a moment before shifting the car into drive. As they moved forward, the fog grew thicker, curling around them like tendrils. The road, once familiar, began to twist and bend in impossible ways, as if the landscape itself had changed. "This isn't right," Samuel muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. The trees seemed to stretch taller, their branches reaching out like claws, closing in on the narrow road. The atmosphere became suffocating, the world around them warped and disorienting. Time itself felt distorted, what should have been minutes stretched into what felt like hours. "We're going in circles," Theo said suddenly. His voice was low, filled with dread. "I've seen that tree before. We passed it 10 minutes ago." Samuel shook his head. "That's not possible. We've been driving straight." But as they continued, it became clear that something was very wrong. The same twisted tree appeared again and again, its branches gnarled and blackened, like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. They were trapped in some kind of loop, the forest playing tricks on their minds. "We need to stop," Elise said, her voice shaking. "We're not getting out this way." Samuel reluctantly pulled the car over to the side of the road, and they all sat in stunned silence, unsure of what to do next. The fog pressed in, thicker than ever, and the whispers they had heard in the forest began to return, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Chapter 18, The Voices of the Lost. As the whispers grew louder, they realized they weren't alone. Shadows moved in the fog, figures barely visible through the thick mist. At first, they seemed distant, like ghosts drifting on the edges of their vision. But soon, they drew closer, their shapes becoming more defined. "They're watching us," Clemens whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing noise. Elise squinted through the fog. Who are they?" Samuel's face was pale as he watched the figures move, their forms shifting and bending unnaturally. "I don't think they're human." The figures began to chant, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. The words were indistinct, but there was a rhythm to them, something primal and terrifying. As the chanting grew louder, the shadows closed in, surrounding the car in a tight circle. "We need to do something," Theo shouted, panic rising in his voice. But what could they do? The figures were everywhere, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. The air grew thick with tension, and the car itself seemed to shake under the weight of the sound. It was as if the forest itself was closing in on them, preparing to swallow them whole. Samuel grabbed the cursed book from the back seat, his hands shaking. "Maybe we didn't destroy it completely. Maybe it's still connected to them." "What are you saying?" Clemens asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know," Samuel said, flipping through the charred pages. "But this thing brought them to us. Maybe it can get rid of them." Chapter 19, The Second Ritual. Samuel's hands moved frantically over the burned pages, searching for something, anything, that could help. The book was damaged, but some of the strange symbols remained, glowing faintly in the dim light. "There's a passage here," Samuel muttered, pointing to the pages. It's a reversal of the summoning ritual. If we perform it, we might be able to break the connection." Theo looked skeptical. "And what if it doesn't work? What if we just make things worse?" "We don't have a choice," Samuel said, his voice tense. "We can't stay here." Without further hesitation, Samuel began to chant the words from the book, his voice shaking as he spoke the unfamiliar language. The others watched in silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. The chanting figures outside the car seemed to hesitate, their voices faltering as if sensing the power of the ritual. As Samuel continued, the air around them began to shift. The fog swirled violently, and the figures in the mist seemed to blur, their shapes becoming less defined. But the ritual was draining, the ancient words pulling something from deep within him. Sweat dripped down his face, and his hands trembled as he struggled to maintain focus. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the air, and the figures vanished, swallowed by the swirling fog. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time since they had left the house, the world seemed still. Chapter 20, The Price Paid. Exhausted, Samuel slumped back in his seat, the cursed book falling from his hands. The road ahead was clear now, the fog dissipating as if the ritual had banished it. But something felt wrong. There was a lingering heaviness in the air, a sense that the danger wasn't truly gone. "Is it over?" Elise asked cautiously, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know," Samuel replied, staring down at the book. "I think we stopped whatever was controlling the shadows, but something tells me this isn't finished." The others exchanged uneasy glances, the tension still thick between them. They had escaped the immediate threat, but at what cost? And as they prepared to move on, they couldn't shake the feeling that the forest hadn't let them go. Not completely. Because no matter how far they ran, the shadows would always be just one step behind. Part 5, The Final Revelation. Chapter 21, The Hollow Return. The car sped down the road, the forest finally receding into the distance. The sky, which had been suffocating under layers of fog, began to lighten, allowing pale moonlight to filter through. Samuel's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. No one spoke. There was a collective understanding that even though the immediate danger had passed, something darker lingered. "We need to get to the town," Theo finally said, breaking the silence. "We can get help there." But Clemence shook her head, her face pale and drawn. "Help? Do you think anyone will believe us? We're alone in this." Elise, staring out the window, her fingers tapping nervously on the door, whispered, "Maybe we aren't supposed to get out. Maybe the forest never really lets anyone go." Her words chilled the group. As they drove further, something unsettling happened. Despite their earlier sense of movement, they passed familiar landmarks, bent trees, old road signs, and twisted bushes. They had driven in a straight line for miles, but the same scenes repeated themselves. "We're still in it," Samuel muttered, his voice trembling. "The forest isn't done with us." Theo's face twisted in frustration. "No. This can't be happening. We destroyed the book. We ended it." Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. Panic surged through the group. Samuel slammed the gas pedal, but the car slowed to a crawl before finally stalling. They were plunged into a suffocating silence, with only the soft rustle of the forest around them. The road ahead, once so promising, was swallowed by shadows. Chapter 22, The Haunting of Loic. In the stillness that followed, a faint sound began to creep toward them from the trees, slow, deliberate footsteps. They were uneven, shuffling as if something injured was dragging itself closer. The group froze, their hearts pounding as the sound grew louder. "Loic," Clemence whispered, dread coating her voice. "It's him." Before anyone could respond, the figure of Loic emerged from the shadows. His body was twisted, his clothes tattered and stained with blood. His eyes, glowing faintly in the moonlight, were hollow, devoid of humanity. He moved with an unnatural jerkiness, as though his body was no longer his own. "Loic?" Elise called out, her voice shaking with fear and guilt. But it wasn't their friend standing before them. The thing that had taken over his body smiled, a grotesque, lopsided grin that sent chills down their spines. "You thought you could escape." The voice that came from his mouth was not his own but a deep, guttural echo. "But the forest is inside you now. It is part of you." Samuel stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you want from us?" Loic, or the creature wearing his skin, laughed, a dry, hollow sound that grated against their nerves. "There is no escape. You belong to us now. The forest is eternal." Without warning, Loic lunged toward them, his movements rapid and unnatural. The group scattered, running in different directions into the darkened woods. Chapter 23, The Maze of Nightmares. Clemence ran, her feet pounding against the uneven forest floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees around her seemed to twist and shift, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, trying to ensnare her. Every step she took felt like sinking deeper into a living nightmare. The forest was no longer just a place, it was alive, aware, and it was hunting them. Ahead of her, she saw Theo and Elise stumble through the underbrush, their faces contorted in fear. Samuel was nowhere to be seen. "We need to stay together," Clemence shouted, her voice hoarse. But the forest was playing tricks on them. Shadows darted in and out of their vision, whispers echoing from all sides, each one more maddening than the last. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, turning their escape into an impossible maze. Theo tripped over a root and fell hard, crying out in pain. Elise skidded to a stop and turned back to help him, but as she did, a shadow passed over her. A figure loomed from the darkness. Loic, or the thing that had taken him, was upon them. "We can't run from this," Theo gasped, struggling to his feet. Clemence knew he was right. They couldn't keep running. But if they couldn't escape, what could they do? Chapter 24, The Sacrifice. In the distance, Samuel had found a clearing. He stood in the center, the cursed book clutched tightly in his hands. Despite the fire that had destroyed it, it seemed to have reformed, the pages whole and alive with dark energy. "It's all in the book," he muttered to himself. "The answer is in here." As he frantically flipped through the pages, the whispers grew louder, and the air around him seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The forest knew he was close to something it wanted to keep hidden. But Samuel wasn't listening. His eyes scanned the ancient symbols until he found the one passage that had been burned into his mind from the first time he opened the book. The forest demands a sacrifice. He finally understood. The ritual they had tried to undo was only half of the equation. They had stopped the summoning, but the price had never been paid. That was why the forest wouldn't let them go, it was still hungry. With trembling hands, Samuel began to chant the words again, but this time, he didn't fight the dark magic that flowed from the pages. He embraced it, pouring all of his fear and desperation into the ritual. The ground beneath him trembled, and the trees groaned in response. The forest was waking, and it was angry. Chapter 25, The Final Offering. Theo, Elise, and Clemence burst into the clearing just as Samuel finished the chant. The air was thick with energy, and a low hum filled the space. In the center of the clearing, a dark shape began to materialize, rising from the ground like smoke. It twisted and coiled, growing taller and more menacing with each passing second. "What did you do?" Elise screamed, her eyes wide with terror. Samuel turned to face them, his expression grim. "I had to finish the ritual. There's no other way." "What does that mean?" Theo asked, his voice cracking. Samuel stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "It means one of us has to stay." Before they could react, the shadowy figure lunged toward them. Its form shifted, becoming more solid, more real. It was the embodiment of the forest's hunger, its wrath. "I'll do it," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll be the one." "No!" Clemence cried, rushing toward him, but Samuel stepped back, raising a hand to stop her. "There's no other way," he said, his voice calm despite the terror swirling around them. "The forest needs a life. If I don't do this, it'll take all of us." The creature loomed over him, its dark form crackling with energy. Samuel looked up at it, his expression resolute. "Take me," he whispered. The forest responded instantly. The creature enveloped Samuel in its shadowy tendrils, pulling him into itself. The others watched in horror as he disappeared, his body dissolving into the darkness. The ground trembled violently, and the trees swayed as if in mourning. Then, as suddenly as it began, the forest grew silent. Epilogue: The Watchers. The three survivors stood in the clearing, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The shadowy creature had vanished, and with it, the curse that had haunted them. But the price had been paid. Samuel was gone, claimed by the forest. Clemence wiped tears from her eyes, her body trembling with exhaustion. "He saved us," she whispered. Theo nodded silently, unable to find words. Elise, her face pale and haunted, stared at the place where Samuel had disappeared. "We need to leave," Theo finally said, his voice hoarse. "Before it changes its mind." They walked back to the car in silence, the forest now eerily calm. The road ahead was clear, no fog, no shadows, just the soft light of a new day. But as they drove away, none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest had taken what it wanted, but it wasn't finished. It never was. Because the forest of shadows always remembers those who trespass. And it waits.